The lilies smelled like a funeral. That was Clara's first thought when the clock struck the half hour. The groom wasn't simply late, he was gone. In the suffocating heat of the cathedral, 200 guests watched her standing rigidly at the altar, waiting for the financial ruin of her family to become official. She didn't weep, she calculated. And then, cutting through the murmuring crowd, the sharp, heavy strike of mud-caked boots echoed on the stone floor. The Duke of Westphal had arrived, but not to apologize. The air inside St. Jude's was thick enough to chew. It tasted of melting beeswax, damp wool, and the suffocatingly sweet rot of white lilies left too long in the July heat. Clara stood at the altar. Her knees were locked. If she bent them even a fraction, she knew the sheer weight of the embroidered silk skirts would pull her to the stone floor. The bodice of her gown, heavily boned with whalebone, and tightly laced by a maid who had cried tears of relief that morning, dug a slow, steady trench into her lower ribs. She breathed shallowly, in, out. A drop of sweat traced a tortuous path from her temple, down her jaw, and vanished into the high, stiff lace collar at her throat. Theo was 30 minutes late. Behind her, the congregation was no longer pretending to hold a respectful silence. The murmurs had started 10 minutes ago as a low, insect-like hum. Now it was a steady, rhythmic buzzing. Fans snapped open and fluttered like panicked birds. Heavy velvet pew cushions creaked as the elite of London shifted their weight, leaning closer to their neighbors to exchange venomous, delighted whispers. Clara stared straight ahead at the vicar. The man was ancient, his vestments hanging off his frail shoulders like laundry on a line. A bead of moisture hung precariously from the tip of his nose. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He kept looking past her, toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the nave, as if sheer force of will could conjure Theodore Harrington from the stifling summer air. It wouldn't. Clara knew it with a cold, settling certainty in the pit of her stomach. Theo was not coming. He had always been a man composed entirely of soft edges. Soft hands, a soft, nervous laugh, and a spine made of wet paper. He had proposed to her because his mother was in Bath, and his father was too gout-ridden to properly manage him. He had liked Clara's sharp wit. He had liked the way she looked in a riding habit. But liking a woman was not enough to weather the storm of marrying into the Ashford family. Clara's father, Lord Ashford, stood to her left. He was breathing heavily through his mouth, producing a faint whistling sound. He smelled of stale gin and panicked sweat. The Ashford estate was entirely liquid, and that liquid had been poured down the throats of thoroughbred horses and dealt away on baize-covered card tables. Theo's dowry settlement was the only thing standing between the Ashfords and the debtor's prison in Fleet. "Papa," Clara whispered. Her voice was dry, cracking slightly. Lord Ashford flinched. He wiped his glistening forehead with a crumpled linen square. "He is merely detained, Clara. Traffic in the square. A thrown shoe on the carriage. It is 35 minutes past the hour. Do not cause a scene." Clara nearly laughed. It was a sharp, jagged impulse that she swallowed down like bile. Do not cause a scene. As if standing abandoned at the high altar of St. Jude's in front of every creditor they owed was not already a scene. She could feel the pity radiating from the front row. It was worse than the malice. Lady Harrington, Theo's aunt, was looking at Clara with her mouth slightly open, a fan pressed to her collarbone. The pity burned. Clara hated it. She would have preferred them to throw rotten fruit. Pity meant she was a victim. Pity meant she was weak. Clara adjusted her grip on her bouquet. The stems were crushed, leaking a green, sticky sap onto the palms of her silk gloves. She was 24, an old maid by the cruel mathematics of the ton. She had traded the last shreds of her pride to secure Theo, smiling at his dull jokes, ignoring his wandering eye, swallowing her own sharp tongue to play the agreeable, grateful bride. And for what? To be left standing in 3 layers of petticoats, suffocating in the heat. A side door near the choir stalls creaked open. The vicar's head snapped up. Lord Ashford let out a pathetic, wheezing gasp of relief. But it wasn't Theo. It was a footman, dressed in the Harrington livery. He scurried along the stone wall, keeping his head bowed, and handed a folded piece of parchment to the vicar. The church went dead silent. The buzzing stopped. 200 people held their breath. The vicar adjusted his spectacles. He broke the wax seal. The parchment crinkled. It was the loudest sound in the world. The vicar read the words, his eyes darting back and forth. His face, already pale, drained to the color of old parchment. He slowly folded the letter. He looked at Lord Ashford. Then, finally, he looked at Clara. "Well?" Clara said. Her voice carried. She didn't care anymore. I am deeply sorry, Lady Clara," the vicar stammered. His voice trembled, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Mr. Harrington has taken ship for the continent. He expresses his profound regrets." A collective gasp ripped through the cathedral. It was followed instantly by an explosion of frantic whispering. Lord Ashford made a sound like a stepped-on dog. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest, supported only by the heavy wooden railing of the altar. Clara didn't move. She didn't drop her bouquet. She didn't faint. She simply stood there, absorbing the blow. The reality of it was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. They were ruined, complete, utter, inescapable ruin. The butchers would stop delivering. The bailiffs would arrive by Tuesday. Her father would likely shoot himself or drink himself to death in a rented room in Cheapside. "Lady Clara," the vicar whispered, leaning over the rail, "perhaps you should step into the vestry to preserve your dignity." Dignity? What a useless, hollow word. Clara looked down at her white silk dress. It looked like a shroud. "Yes," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any tremble. "The vestry." She turned. She did not look at the congregation. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her eyes fixed on the heavy oak door of the antechamber. She walked with measured, even steps. The silk of her gown dragged against the stone, a loud, abrasive scraping sound. She could feel the eyes on her back, tiny needles of schadenfreude and horror. Let them look. She pushed open the heavy door of the vestry and stepped into the cool, dusty darkness. The door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the noise of the crowd, leaving her alone with the silence and the smell of old paper and damp stone. The vestry was small, lit only by a narrow stained glass window set high in the wall. The light filtering through the red and blue glass cast bruised, purple shadows across the flagstones. Clara walked to the center of the room and stopped. She dropped the ruined bouquet. It hit the floor with a dull thud. She reached up with trembling hands and began to pry the pearl-tipped pins from her veil. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy. One of the pins snagged on her scalp, pulling hard enough to bring tears to her eyes, but she yanked it free anyway, tossing the heavy, suffocating lace onto a nearby chair. She needed to breathe. She gripped the edge of a heavy oak table, leaning her weight against it. The corset was a vice. The door banged open. Clara flinched, expecting her father, readying herself for the torrent of weeping and self-pity. But the man who stepped into the vestry was not her father. He was entirely too large for the small room. He didn't walk. He stalked, his movements carrying a blunt, aggressive efficiency. He wore a dark, heavy riding coat that was entirely inappropriate for a formal morning wedding, and his knee-high leather boots were caked in dried mud. Clara straightened immediately, her spine snapping back into its rigid posture. "This is a private room," she said. Gideon Rothbrook, the Duke of Westfall, did not apologize. He kicked the heavy oak door shut behind him with the heel of his boot. The sound was like a gunshot in the enclosed space. "Your father is currently having a fit of hysterics in the nave," Westfall said. His voice was a low, rough rumble. It lacked the polished, aristocratic drawl of the men Clara was used to. It sounded like gravel being crushed under a wagon wheel. "The vicar is attempting to revive him with smelling salts. It is a pathetic display." Clara stiffened. She knew Westfall by reputation, though they had never formally been introduced. Everyone knew Westfall. He was a northern duke, a man who preferred his coal mines and ironworks to the ballrooms of Mayfair. He was rumored to be utterly ruthless, a man who had once locked striking workers out in the snow until they starved into submission. Looking at him now, Clara believed it. His face was harsh, composed of sharp angles and deep shadows. A thin, jagged scar cut through the line of his left eyebrow, pulling the skin slightly taut. His eyes were the color of slate, and they looked at her without a trace of the pity she had endured out in the church. He looked at her the way a man inspects a piece of livestock or a ledger. "I am aware of my father's constitution, Your Grace," Clara said coldly. "If you have come to gawk at the ruined bride, you have seen her. You may leave." Westfall didn't move. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy coat and withdrew a silver pocket watch. He flicked it open with his thumb. The loud metallic click echoed in the room. "It is 10 minutes to noon," he said, reading the dial. He snapped the watch shut and returned it to his pocket. "The banns have been read. The priest is in his vestments. The register is open on the altar." "Are you taking inventory?" Clara snapped, her patience fraying. "I am stating facts," Westfall replied, taking a step closer. He smelled of damp wool, saddle leather, and the sharp ozone tang of an approaching storm. It was a harsh smell, entirely devoid of cologne or bay rum. Fact 1. Theodore Harrington is halfway to Dover. He will not return. Fact 2. Your father owes £60,000 to men who break kneecaps before they seize assets. Fact 3. By tomorrow morning, you will be a social pariah, and by next week, you will be destitute. Clara's hands gripped the edge of the oak table so tightly, her knuckles turned white. "Get out!" Fact 4, Westfall continued, ignoring her completely. "I require a wife, immediately." Clara froze. The breath hitched in her throat. She stared at him, searching his scarred, impassive face for the punchline of a cruel joke. But there was no humor in his slate-gray eyes, just flat, absolute pragmatism. "What?" she breathed. "The Crown has stipulated that to finalize the land grants in the Northumberland territory, I must be married before the end of the fiscal quarter. That is in 3 days," Westfall said. He spoke as if he were discussing the purchase of a horse. "I have no time to court a woman. I have no desire to woo a debutante. I need a woman with a respectable title, who knows how to keep her mouth shut, manage a household, and expect nothing in the way of sentiment." He looked her up and down. It wasn't a sexual appraisal, it was an assessment of durability. "You're currently standing in a wedding dress. You're desperate. I'm wealthy. The solution is obvious." Clara felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her chest. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. "You are insane. You burst into a vestry to propose marriage to a woman who was jilted 5 minutes ago?" "I am not proposing, Lady Clara. I am offering a transaction," Westfall said. He stepped closer. He was tall enough that Clara had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. "If you walk out that door alone, your life is over. If you walk out with me, your father's debts will be cleared by 3 o'clock this afternoon. You will have the title of Duchess. You will never want for money, food, or shelter for the rest of your natural life." "And in return?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "In return, you sign the register. You come north with me tonight. You warm my bed. You bear my heirs. And you do not ask me for love," he said bluntly. "I have none to give." Clara stared at him. Her heart was hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against her bruised ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run. This man was dangerous. He was cold, hard, and entirely devoid of the soft, polite fictions that governed her world. But Theo had been full of polite fictions. Theo had whispered sweet things in her ear, kissed her hands, and then left her to face the wolves alone. Westfall wasn't hiding his teeth. He was showing them to her up front. She looked at his hands. They weren't soft. The knuckles were calloused, the nails clipped short. They were the hands of a man who did things, who solved problems. She thought of the debtor's prison, the damp walls, the cough that would eventually kill her father, the reality of working as a governess, abused by spoiled children, her youth draining away in someone else's nursery. "My father's debts," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. "All of them, even the gambling vows held by the private clubs." Westfall's eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of something, perhaps approval, passed through the slate gray. "Every penny, paid today. I require an independent allowance. 500 a year, in my name, in a separate account. 300, and I will pay for your gowns. 400, and I pay for my own gowns. I won't have you reviewing my milliner's bills. Westfall held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The dust motes danced in the shaft of purple light between them. The silence was heavy, thick with the weight of the irreversible choice. Agreed, he said softly. He held out his hand. The palm was broad, the skin rough. Clara looked at it. She took a slow, deep breath, feeling the whalebone of her corset dig one final time into her flesh. She reached out, her white silk glove contrasting sharply against his bare, tanned skin, and placed her hand in his. His grip was iron. It was warm. It did not shake. Then let us not keep the vicar waiting, Your Grace, Clara said. The church had not emptied. When the heavy oak door of the vestry creaked open, the frantic whispering of the congregation severed instantly. 200 heads whipped around. They had expected to see Lady Clara Ashford emerge weeping, supported by the vicar, a tragic figure of absolute ruin. Instead, Clara stepped out into the nave with her chin raised. Her veil was gone. Her face was stark, pale, and entirely dry, and her hand was resting firmly in the crook of the Duke of Westfall's arm. A collective stunned silence fell over St. Jude's. It was so quiet Clara could hear the faint, high-pitched ringing in her own ears. Westfall's stride was long and purposeful. Clara had to force her legs to keep up, the heavy silk skirts dragging against the stones. He didn't look at the guests. He moved down the aisle like a warship cutting through still water, his sheer physical presence parting the air. Clara kept her eyes locked on the altar. She saw her father. Lord Ashford was slumped in a chair near the choir stalls, a damp cloth pressed to his forehead. When he saw Clara and the towering, dark-clad man beside her, his jaw went slack. The damp cloth fell into his lap. The vicar, still clutching the Book of Common Prayer to his chest like a shield, backed up a half step as Westfall approached the altar rail. "Your Grace," the vicar squeaked. "We are pressed for time, Vicar," Westfall said. His voice easily carried to the back of the silent church. "Skip the sermon, skip the hymns, move directly to the declarations and the vows." The vows? The vicar looked frantically from Westfall to Clara. "But the banns were read for Mr. Harrington." "I possess a special license from the Archbishop," Westfall interrupted, reaching into his coat and tossing a heavy folded vellum document onto the altar. It landed with a solid smack. "Procured this morning. It leaves the name of the bride blank. Lady Clara has agreed to fill that blank. Proceed." The vicar looked at the license. He looked at the Duke's hard, unrelenting stare. He swallowed hard. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice cracking. Clara stood numbly. It was happening too fast. The adrenaline that had carried her through the vestry negotiation was beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, floating sensation. She was standing in the exact same spot she had been 20 minutes ago, but the world had inverted. Theo's ghost was gone. Beside her was a wall of solid, radiating heat. Westfall stood perfectly still. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't fidget. He emanated an aura of controlled violence and absolute authority. "I require the rings," the vicar stammered, reaching the appropriate point in the rushed liturgy. Clara froze. Theo had taken the wedding band with him to Dover. Westfall didn't miss a beat. He stripped off his leather riding gloves, stuffing them into his pocket. He reached over with his right hand and grasped his left pinky finger. With a sharp twist, he pulled off a heavy, scarred gold signet ring. It was stamped with the snarling wolf of the Westfall crest. He took Clara's left hand. His fingers were rough, the skin raspy against her bare knuckles as he stripped away her silk glove. His thumb brushed over her pulse point. His skin was warm, calloused from reins and sword hilts. He didn't look into her eyes with soft devotion. He looked at her hand. "With this ring I thee wed," Westfall said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. It wasn't a promise of love. It was the sealing of a contract. He shoved the heavy gold ring onto her fourth finger. It was massive. It slid over her knuckle with zero resistance, and hung loosely at the base of her finger. The metal was cold at first, but it quickly absorbed the heat of her skin. It smelled faintly of brass polish and old wax. It weighed down her hand like an anchor. "I pronounce that they be man and wife together." The vicar rushed out, his eyes darting to the imposing duke. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen." Silence. The vicar waited. Traditionally, this was the moment the groom lifted the veil and kissed the bride. Clara had no veil, and Westfall clearly had no intention of kissing her. He didn't lean in. He didn't touch her face. Instead, he simply looked down at her. His slate eyes met hers, and for a fraction of a second, Clara saw a spark of something intense and unreadable beneath the flat pragmatism, a recognition, a warning. "The register," Westfall commanded. He turned away, striding toward the heavy book resting on a side table. Clara followed. Her hand felt strange, weighted down by the massive hunk of gold. She took the quill the vicar offered with a trembling hand. The ink was dark, stark against the thick paper. She signed her name, Clara Ashford. Beside it, the ink still wet, was a sharp, aggressive slash of handwriting. Gideon Rothbrook, Duke of Westfall. It was done. She was married to a stranger, a ruthless, hardened stranger who had bought her like a piece of distressed property. Westfall turned to her. He extended his arm once more. "Come along, Duchess," he said. The title sounded strange on his tongue, sharp and unfamiliar. "We have a carriage waiting. The roads north turn to mud if it rains." Clara took his arm. As they turned back to face the aisle, the shock in the room finally broke. The whispers erupted, 10 times louder than before. She walked past Lady Harrington, whose face had gone the color of spoiled milk. She walked past her father, who was staring at Westfall with a mixture of terror and greedy relief. She didn't look at any of them. She kept her eyes on the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral. She was leaving the rotting lilies behind. But as she stepped out into the bright, harsh glare of the midday sun, the heavy gold ring sliding loosely on her finger, Clara realized she had no idea what kind of darkness she was walking into. The carriage was a monstrous thing. It was built of unpolished dark wood and sprung with heavy iron bands that groaned a deep metallic protest every time the wheels found a rut in the cobbles. It smelled of cold dust, saddle leather, and the sharp, acrid scent of a damp wool blanket folded on the opposite seat. It was a vehicle designed for endurance, not for the delicate sensibilities of a bride. Clara sat rigidly on the worn leather squabs. She was still wearing the white silk wedding gown. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the vestry and down the aisle of St. Jude's was draining away, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. Her body felt like it was made of lead and bruised glass. Every jolt of the carriage sent a fresh spike of agony through her ribs where the whalebone corset dug into her flesh. Opposite her, Gideon Rothbrook, the Duke of Westfall, took up entirely too much space. He had not spoken a word since he had handed her into the carriage. As soon as the heavy door slammed shut, he had reached into a leather satchel at his feet, withdrawn a thick stack of folded, wax-sealed correspondence, and begun to read. He didn't look out the window as London gave way to the sprawling, muddy fields of the outer suburbs. He simply read, his dark brows drawn together in a slight frown, his jaw locked. Clara watched him covertly. In the dim light of the carriage interior, the jagged scar through his eyebrow looked deeper, pulling the skin white. He was not a handsome man. His features were too harsh, too blunt. But there was a brutal, undeniable magnetism to his stillness. He did not fidget. He was entirely contained. A particularly deep pothole sent the carriage violently to the left. Clara gasped as she was thrown against the wooden wall. The boning of her bodice, already tight enough to restrict her breathing, pinched savagely inward. A sharp, audible crack echoed in the small space as one of the stays snapped. The jagged edge of the whalebone instantly dug into the soft skin beneath her arm. "Damn it!" she hissed through her teeth, the polite veneer of a lady entirely forgotten in the face of sudden, sharp pain. Westfall looked up from his letter. His slate eyes dropped from her face to her chest, assessing the rigid, unnatural shape of the gown. "You're wearing a cage," he observed flatly. "I'm wearing the height of French fashion," Clara retorted, breathless. She pressed a gloved hand to her ribs, trying to alleviate the pressure of the broken stay. It didn't work. The broken edge was acting like a serrated knife against her ribs with every sway of the coach. And right now, it is attempting to puncture my lung. Westfall stared at her for a second. He set his letters down on the leather seat. Without a word, he reached into the inner pocket of his heavy riding coat and pulled out a knife. It was a hunting knife. The handle was carved staghorn, the blade 6 inches of dark, polished steel that gleamed wickedly in the dim light. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes went wide. Westfall leaned forward, closing the distance between them. He didn't offer the handle. He extended his arm, holding the blade flat on his palm, presenting it to her. "You cut it," he said. Clara stared at the steel. "Cut the dress? It is Calais silk. It cost 80 guineas. It is currently bleeding you," Westfall replied. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. He wasn't teasing her. He wasn't being chivalrous. He was identifying a problem and offering a solution. "I bought your debts for £60,000, Duchess. I hardly care about an 80-guinea dress. Cut the laces." Clara looked at his hand. The knuckles were dusted with dark hair, the skin deeply tanned and rough. She reached out and took the knife. The staghorn was warm from his body heat. It was terrifyingly heavy. She awkwardly shifted her weight, bringing the blade to the front of her bodice. The laces were thick, braided silk, pulled impossibly tight and knotted beneath a decorative panel. Her hands were shaking slightly. She angled the blade and pressed it against the top cord. The knife was razor sharp. The thick silk cord parted with a faint pop. She worked the blade down. Pop, pop, pop. With every severed lace, the crushing pressure around her ribs eased. The whalebone cage sprang outward. The sudden rush of oxygen into the bottom of her lungs was intoxicating. It tasted like salvation. Clara closed her eyes, letting her head fall back against the leather squabs as she dragged in a deep, shuddering breath. The broken stay shifted, no longer biting into her skin. When she opened her eyes, Westfall was watching her. He wasn't looking at the exposed, ruffled linen of her chemise or the ruined, gaping front of the expensive silk gown. He was looking at her face. She held the knife out to him, handle first. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was raspy, deeper than usual. He took the knife, the calloused pads of his fingers brushing against hers. He folded it away in a smooth, practiced motion and picked up his letters again. "Throw the ruined silk out the window when we reach the woods," he said, not looking up. "I despise the smell of rotting flowers, and that gown reeks of them." Clara looked down at the slashed white silk. She reached up, gripped the edges of the bodice, and peeled the heavy, suffocating fabric off her shoulders. She didn't care about modesty. She cared about breathing. Underneath, she wore a simple linen shift and a lightweight woolen traveling skirt she had layered beneath the petticoats that morning to combat the drafty church. She bundled the ruined Calais silk into a ball. She didn't wait for the woods. She rolled down the carriage window, letting the cool, damp afternoon air rush in and shove the bundle out. It hit the muddy road with a wet, heavy thud. She sat back. She was no longer a bride. She was a woman in a linen shift and a gold signet ring that belonged to a stranger. And for the first time that day, she felt perfectly clear-headed. The rain began just after twilight. It didn't fall. It drove sideways, a relentless, icy assault that rattled against the wooden walls of the coach like a handful of gravel. The temperature plummeted. Summer in the south of England was a distant memory. The air that seeped through the cracks in the window frames smelled of wet earth, wood smoke, and the bitter cold of the approaching north. Clara shivered. The linen shift and thin woolen skirt were entirely inadequate. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, tucking her hands into her armpits, trying to conserve whatever body heat she had left. Her teeth were clamped together to keep them from chattering. Westfall had lit a small brass carriage lantern. It swung violently from an iron hook in the ceiling, casting chaotic, leaping shadows across his scarred face. He was finally done reading. He sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He didn't seem to feel the cold at all. At 9:15, the coach suddenly lurched, the horses whinnying in exhausted protest, and ground to a halt. Westfall's eyes snapped open. The slate gray caught the light of the lantern. He pushed open the carriage door before the footman could reach it, stepping out into the driving rain without a flinch. "The Red Lion," he said, looking back into the carriage. Rainwater was already plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "A coaching inn. The horses are blown. We stay here for the night." Clara didn't argue. Her limbs felt stiff, frozen into place. She uncrossed her arms and tried to stand, but her left foot was completely asleep. She stumbled, falling forward toward the open door. A large hand caught her by the upper arm. The grip was immovable. Westfall practically lifted her out of the carriage, depositing her onto the muddy ground under the overhanging eaves of the inn. "Can you walk?" he asked bluntly. "Yes," she lied. Her teeth were chattering so hard the word broke in half. Westfall didn't press the issue. He put a hand on the small of her back, a heavy, warm weight that penetrated the thin linen, and steered her through the low wooden door of the inn. The tap room was a wall of heat, noise, and the overpowering stench of stale ale, roasting mutton, and unwashed bodies. A dozen men in rough-spun wool looked up from their tankards as the Duke and his shivering, half-dressed companion walked in. Westfall didn't even blink. He strode directly to the innkeeper, a fat man wiping a pewter mug with a dirty rag. "A private parlor, your best bedchamber, and hot food. Immediately," Westfall ordered. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer, hard authority in his tone made the innkeeper drop his rag and scramble to bow. Yes, my lord. Right away, my lord. This way." The private parlor was a small, dusty room at the back of the inn, but it had a massive stone fireplace. A frightened-looking serving girl was frantically stoking a struggling fire. Westfall shut the door, cutting off the noise of the tap room. He looked at Clara. She was standing in the center of the room, shivering violently, her lips tinged blue. He unclasped his heavy riding coat. It was thick, waxed wool, lined with a dark fur. He stepped behind her and dropped it over her shoulders. The weight of it almost buckled her knees. It swallowed her completely, falling to the tops of her boots. It was incredibly warm, trapping the heat of his body against hers. It smelled intensely of him, rain, leather, cold metal, and the faint, earthy scent of a horse. "Sit down by the fire," he commanded, pulling a heavy wooden chair closer to the hearth. "Before you collapse and become a logistical problem." Clara sank into the chair, pulling the edges of the massive coat tightly around her throat. "Your flattery is overwhelming, Your Grace." Westfall pulled up a stool on the opposite side of the fire. He didn't smile, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. "Flattery is a waste of breath. You're freezing. I require a living wife to finalize my land patents." The serving girl returned, balancing a heavy wooden tray. She set down 2 chipped earthenware bowls filled with a thick, greasy brown stew, half a loaf of hard-crusted bread, and 2 tankards of dark ale. She practically fled the room afterward. Clara looked at the bowl. It was unappetizing. The fat was congealing at the edges. A day ago, at the Ashford dining table, she would have sent it back to the kitchens with a sharp reprimand. But her stomach twisted with a sudden, agonizing cramp. She hadn't eaten since a single piece of dry toast yesterday morning. The corset had made eating impossible. The anxiety had made it unthinkable. She picked up the crude wooden spoon. She didn't hesitate. She ate. The stew tasted of salt, old onions, and tough mutton, but to Clara it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She ate quickly, methodically, ignoring the grease that coated the spoon. She tore off a hunk of the hard bread and used it to wipe the bottom of the bowl clean. When she finally looked up, washing the last bite down with a swallow of the bitter, room-temperature ale, Westfall was watching her. He hadn't touched his own bowl. "What?" Clara snapped, feeling a sudden flush of embarrassment. "Did I fail to observe the proper etiquette for eating tavern slop?" "Most women of your station would have wept at the sight of it," Westfall said softly. The firelight flickered in his slate eyes, casting deep shadows over his scar. "Or demanded a roasted pheasant." "Most women of my station are currently asleep on the silk pillows in Mayfair," Clara said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She didn't care anymore. The rules of polite society had been severed the moment she signed that register. I was hungry. I ate. Westfall stared at her for a long, silent moment. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against the small window pane filled the quiet space between them. Then he pushed his own untouched bowl of stew across the rough wooden table toward her. "Eat this one too," he said. "We leave at first light." Clara looked at the bowl, then at the Duke. There was no pity in his face, just a stark, pragmatic acknowledgement of her physical reality. She didn't say thank you. She just picked up her spoon and pulled the bowl closer. They rode for 2 more days. The landscape transformed, dying a slow death outside the carriage window. The lush, manicured green rolling hills of the south gave way to jagged, brutalist terrain. Trees grew sparse and twisted, permanently bent by the relentless wind coming off the moors. The air changed. It lost the sweet smell of vegetation and took on a metallic, sulfurous edge. It was the smell of industry, the smell of earth being ripped open. "We are crossing the boundary," Westfall said abruptly, late on the 3rd afternoon. It was the first time he had spoken in hours. Clara leaned toward the window. In the distance, the sky was smeared with a permanent gray smudge of smoke. She could hear it before she saw it, a deep, rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floorboards of the carriage. It sounded like a massive mechanical heartbeat. "The foundries," Westfall said, noticing her tracking the sound. "Iron, coal, the lifeblood of the North. It is loud, it is dirty, and it is mine." He spoke of the smoke and the noise with a possessive pride that a southern lord might reserve for a prized hunting hound. An hour later, the carriage turned off the main road, passing between 2 massive, unadorned pillars of black stone. There were no ornate iron gates. There was no tree-lined avenue. The carriage simply began a brutal, steep ascent up a winding, rocky road. At the summit, sitting like a bird of prey upon the crag, was Ravenshaw. Clara pressed her face to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. It wasn't a manor house. It was a fortress, built of dark, rough-hewn granite that seemed to absorb the twilight. The estate was massive, blocky, and utterly devoid of architectural warmth. There were no decorative columns, no sweeping terraces. Narrow windows punctuated the thick walls like arrow slits. It looked as though it had been carved directly from the angry rock beneath it. The carriage rumbled into a central courtyard and groaned to a final halt. The door was wrenched open by a footman dressed in dark gray livery. He didn't bow, he merely offered a stiff nod. Westfall stepped out, and Clara followed, her boots hitting the damp, uneven cobblestones. The wind up here was vicious. It whipped Clara's thin woolen skirt around her ankles and bit through her chemise. She clutched her arms tightly. The heavy oak doors of Ravenshaw were hauled open. Waiting in the archway was not a line of powdered, bowing servants, but a single woman. She was tall, dressed in a severe charcoal gray gown with a ring of heavy iron keys hanging from her waist. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. "Mrs. Hess," Westfall said, striding toward the door. "Your Grace," the woman replied. Her voice was sharp, a distinct northern burr rounding the vowels. Her eyes slid past the Duke and landed on Clara. The assessment was quick, ruthless, and entirely devoid of deference. Clara felt like a bolt of cloth being inspected for flaws. "This is the Duchess," Westfall announced. He didn't use Clara's name. "She's tired. She's cold. Have a fire lit in the east wing chambers. Have a bath drawn." Mrs. Hess gave a short, stiff nod. "Yes, Your Grace. The ledgers from the Lower Valley mine are waiting in your study. The foreman requires an audience." "Send him in. I will eat my supper at my desk." Westfall turned to Clara. They stood in the cavernous, drafty entrance hall. The walls were bare stone. The only light came from heavily wrought iron sconces holding thick, smoking tallow candles. It was a house completely empty of softness. "Mrs. Hess will show you to your rooms," Westfall said. His tone was brisk, his mind clearly already miles away, buried in ledgers and coal dust. "Dinner for the household is at 8. We do not dress for it. If you require anything, ask Mrs. Hess. Do not disturb me in my study unless the house is actively burning to the ground." He didn't wait for her to reply. He turned on his heel, his mud-caked boots echoing sharply on the stone floor, and disappeared down a dark, vaulted corridor. Clara stood alone in the center of the hall. The silence he left behind was heavy. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," Mrs. Hess said. It wasn't a request. Clara followed the housekeeper up a wide, sweeping stone staircase that lacked a carpet. Her footsteps felt loud, intrusive. They walked down a long, drafty hallway to a heavy oak door at the end of the east wing. Mrs. Hess pushed it open. The room was vast. It was dominated by a massive four-poster bed made of dark, carved wood, hung with heavy velvet curtains the color of bruised plums. The fire was already blazing in the massive stone hearth, casting a warm, desperate glow against the chill. "The water for your bath will be brought up shortly," Mrs. Hess said, standing rigidly by the door. "Your trunks?" "I have none," Clara said. Her voice sounded thin in the enormous room. "I arrived with what I'm wearing." Mrs. Hess's eyebrows flickered upward for a fraction of a second, the only sign of surprise she allowed herself. "I see. I will have a nightdress brought to you from the storerooms. Good evening, Your Grace." The heavy door clicked shut. The latch fell with a solid, echoing thud. Clara was alone. She walked slowly toward the fire. The heat radiated outward, thawing the chill that had settled deep into her bones over the past 3 days. She stood before the flames, staring into the burning coals. She lifted her left hand. The firelight caught the scarred gold of the massive signet ring that hung loosely on her finger. It clinked softly against itself as she moved her hand. She had sold herself to a stranger. She had left behind the polite cruelty of London for the brutal, freezing reality of the North. She was standing in a fortress at the edge of the world, married to a man whose heart was forged of iron and coal. Clara curled her hand into a fist, feeling the cold weight of the gold press into her palm. She didn't cry. Instead, she took a long, slow breath of the smoke-tinged air. She was alive. She was solvent. And for the first time in her life, no one was expecting her to smile. The first morning at Ravenshaw did not begin with a gentle rapping at the door and a silver tray of chocolate. It began with the distant mechanical shriek of a steam whistle. Clara woke with a sharp gasp. The massive bedroom was freezing. The fire had died down to a few glowing, resentful embers. She threw back the heavy velvet quilt and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet hit the stone floor, and the cold shot up her legs like a physical blow. She was wearing a rough linen nightgown, provided last night by a tight-lipped maid. It smelled strongly of lye soap and dried lavender, and it swallowed her whole. She stood, shivering, and looked out the narrow window. The sky was the color of a bruised iron pot. A fine layer of black soot coated the outer sill, shifting slightly in the harsh wind. There was no bell pull to summon a maid. There was no water in the pitcher. Clara walked to the washstand, picked up the empty porcelain pitcher, and opened her door. The hallway was cavernous and silent. She didn't retreat. She walked down the freezing, uncarpeted stairs in her bare feet and oversized nightgown, the pitcher clanking softly against her thigh. She found the kitchens by following the smell of wood smoke and boiling oats. It was a massive, vaulted room bustling with scullery maids and cookboys, all moving in a chaotic but efficient rhythm. The noise died the instant Clara stepped over the threshold. A dozen pairs of eyes stared at her. A duchess in the kitchens, barefoot and dressed like a scullery maid, was an aberration. Mrs. Hess stepped out from the pantry, a heavy ring of keys jangling at her waist. Her eyes narrowed into sharp, disapproving slits. "Your Grace, this is not the place for you. A maid would have been sent up." "When?" Clara asked. Her voice was perfectly steady, cutting through the heavy smell of boiling porridge. "Before or after noon?" Mrs. Hess stiffened. "I require hot water," Clara said, stepping fully into the room. The flagstones were warmer here, heated by the massive hearth. "I require 3 plain, durable woolen dresses, dark colors. I require a pair of leather boots that can withstand the mud." "And Mrs. Hess?" The housekeeper's jaw locked. "Yes, Your Grace. I require the household ledgers. Bring them to the morning room after I'm dressed." Clara didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back up the stairs, her spine straight. She was not going to be a ghost in this fortress, haunting the velvet-draped rooms while the men worked. She had sold her life to Gideon Rothbrook, and she intended to manage her half of the bargain. An hour later, dressed in a borrowed, slightly ill-fitting gray wool gown that scratched at her collarbone, Clara sat in the drafty morning room. Spread across the massive oak table were 3 heavy leather-bound ledgers. The ink was faded in places, the columns of numbers jagged and rushed. The door handle turned with a heavy clack. Westfall walked in. He looked exactly as he had yesterday. Dark riding coat, mud-splattered boots, his face a harsh mask of angles and shadows. He stopped just inside the doorway, his slate eyes dropping to the ledgers, then up to her face. "Mrs. Hess informed me you raided the kitchens barefoot and demanded the accounts," he said. The low rumble of his voice held no anger, only a cautious curiosity. "The accounts are a disaster," Clara said, not looking up. She dipped a quill into an inkwell and drew a sharp line through a column. "You are being robbed blind by the butcher in the lower village. He's charging you for prime cuts of beef, but the kitchens are serving tough mutton and calling it stew. And your expenditure on tallow candles is astronomical. Beeswax would be cheaper and produce less soot." Westfall walked slowly toward the table. He stood over her, casting a heavy shadow across the parchment. He smelled of cold air and sulfur. "I do not have time to manage the butcher," he said flatly. "I know," Clara replied, turning the page. The paper was thick and fibrous. "That is why you bought a wife, to manage the things beneath your notice." She finally looked up at him. She expected irritation. She expected the arrogant dismissal she had seen on the faces of the men in London when a woman dared to speak of commerce. Instead, Westfall was looking at her mouth. Then his eyes flicked up to hers. The slate was dark, intense. He reached out, his calloused forefinger tapping the open page of the ledger. "The butcher's name is Miller," Westfall said quietly. "Fire him. Hire the man in the next valley over, and buy the beeswax." "I intend to," Clara said. He stared at her for a second longer, the muscle in his jaw ticking. Then he turned and walked out of the room. The heavy door clicked shut. Clara looked down at the ledger. Her hands were shaking, just slightly. She gripped the edge of the table, grounding herself against the solid oak, and dipped her quill back into the ink. Autumn descended on Ravenshaw, not with the change of colors, but with a deepening of the gray. The wind howled constantly, rattling the narrow window panes and seeping through the stone walls. Clara and Gideon lived in a strange, brutal orbit. They shared meals in silence at the end of a long mahogany table. They shared the massive, velvet-draped bed at night, separated by 2 feet of mattress and an impenetrable wall of exhaustion. He took her with a rough, efficient necessity that left her breathless but emotionally untouched. There were no sweet words in the dark. There was only the harsh rasp of his breathing and the heavy, crushing weight of his body. It was a transaction of the flesh, exactly as he had promised. Clara spent her days fighting the estate. She fired 3 thieving servants. She reorganized the pantries. She forced Mrs. Hess to acknowledge her authority not through titles, but through sheer, unrelenting competence. She learned the smell of lye, the texture of rough wool, and the bitter taste of the strong black tea the servants drank. She was surviving. Then, on a freezing Tuesday in November, the mechanical heartbeat of the valley stopped. Clara was in the storeroom counting sacks of flour when the deep, rhythmic thumping of the foundry engines suddenly ceased. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was terrifying. It was heavy. Wrong. A second later, the frantic, high-pitched shrieking of the foundry bell shattered the quiet. It was the emergency bell. Clara dropped her clipboard. It hit the stone floor with a sharp crack. She ran. She burst through the heavy oak doors into the courtyard, just as Gideon was vaulting onto the bare back of a massive black gelding. He didn't have his heavy coat. He was in his shirt sleeves, his face pale and tight. "Gideon!" Clara yelled over the howling wind. It was the first time she had used his given name. He hauled violently on the reins, turning the panicked horse. "A cave-in at the lower iron shaft. The pumps failed. The water's rising." He didn't say goodbye. He spurred the horse, tearing down the steep rocky path toward the valley floor at a breakneck, suicidal pace. Clara didn't hesitate. She didn't return to the parlor to wait for news. She turned back into the fortress. "Mrs. Hesse!" Clara's voice cracked like a whip through the vaulted hall. "Get the maids! Tear every spare linen sheet in the east wing into strips. Bring all the carbolic acid and boiled water you have. Have the stable boys hitch the flatbed wagons. Now!" 30 minutes later, Clara was sitting in the back of a jolting, unsprung wooden wagon, surrounded by crates of bandages and sloshing buckets of hot water. The sky above the valley was choked with thick black smoke. The smell was horrendous, burning coal, wet earth, and the sharp metallic tang of fear. When they reached the mine head, it was chaos. Women from the village were screaming, clawing at the wooden barricades. Men covered head to toe in black soot were frantically hauling on heavy hemp ropes, trying to clear the rubble from the collapsed shaft entrance. Clara jumped down into the mud. Her heavy skirts instantly soaked up the freezing black sludge. She didn't look for Gideon immediately. She set up a triage station near the boiler house, away from the collapsing mud bank. "Here," she ordered, grabbing a stunned village woman by the shoulders. "Hold this basin. If a man comes up bleeding, you bring him to me." For 3 hours, it was a blur of blood, soot, and screaming. Clara's hands were stained crimson and black. She wrapped crushed limbs. She poured carbolic acid into open wounds, ignoring the agonizing curses of the injured men. She wiped sweat from blackened foreheads and closed the eyes of 2 men who were pulled from the earth, already gone. The heat from the boilers was suffocating, warring with the freezing rain that had begun to fall. It was near twilight when the crowd near the shaft entrance let out a massive, roaring cheer. Clara stood up, her back screaming in protest. She wiped a bloody forearm across her forehead, smearing soot across her cheek. Walking out of the mouth of the collapsed tunnel, flanked by 2 exhausted miners, was Gideon. He was unrecognizable. His white shirt was torn to shreds, plastered to his body with mud and blood. His face was entirely black, the jagged scar standing out as a stark white line. He was carrying a man over his shoulders, a young boy, barely 15, whose leg was crushed at a gruesome angle. Gideon didn't look like a duke. He didn't look like the cold, ruthless man who had bought her in a London vestry. He looked like a demon dragged up from the pits of hell, fueled entirely by a violent, desperate refusal to let his men die. He walked directly to Clara's triage station. He lowered the boy onto a canvas cot with surprising gentleness. He looked up at Clara. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving. Blood was steadily dripping from a deep gash on his left forearm, mixing with the mud on his hands. He took in her ruined dress, her blood-stained hands, the organized chaos of her medical station. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his slate eyes burning with something completely raw and unguarded through the mask of soot. Then he turned and walked back toward the collapsing tunnel. It was past midnight when they finally returned to Ravenshaw. The estate was deadly quiet. Clara had instructed Mrs. Hesse to keep the water boiling. She walked into the east wing bedchamber. The fire was roaring. A heavy copper hip bath sat on the stone hearth, steaming slightly. The door clicked open behind her. Gideon stepped inside. He moved slowly, his sheer physical strength finally stripped away by exhaustion. He shut the door and leaned his forehead against the heavy wood for a long moment. The silence in the room was thick, ringing in the aftermath of the day's screaming. Clara walked to the washstand. She picked up a heavy linen towel and a cake of harsh lye soap. "Take off your shirt," she said. Her voice was a raspy whisper. Her throat was raw from the smoke. Gideon pushed off the door. He didn't argue. His fingers were clumsy, stiff with cold and dried mud. He managed to undo the remaining buttons of his ruined shirt and peeled it off his shoulders. It hit the floor with a wet smack. His torso was covered in bruises, deep purple and angry red against his pale skin. The gash on his forearm had stopped bleeding, but it was ugly, crusted with coal dust. "Sit by the fire," Clara ordered. He sat heavily on a low wooden stool. Clara knelt beside him. She dipped the rough cloth into the basin of hot water, lathered it with the lye soap, and brought it to his arm. He flinched as the harsh soap hit the open wound. The muscles in his back corded tightly. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice losing its edge. She cleaned the cut methodically, washing away the black grit until the pink raw flesh was visible. She bound it tightly with a strip of clean linen. Then she moved to his back. She washed the soot and mud from his skin, her hands moving in long, firm strokes. The water in the basin turned a dark, murky gray. She could feel the heavy thumping rhythm of his heart beneath his ribs. It was a deeply intimate act, utterly devoid of romance. It was the intimacy of survival, the washing away of the battlefield. "You did not faint," Gideon said suddenly. His voice was rough, scraping against the quiet of the room. He didn't turn around. "No," Clara said, rinsing the cloth. "I did not." 5 men died, he said. The words tasted like ash. 30 lived, Clara countered, pressing the hot cloth against the tight muscles of his shoulders. "Because you went into the mud to pull them out. London thinks you are a monster who starves his workers." Gideon let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "I am a monster. I keep them in the dark to dig my wealth. I own them." "You dragged a boy out on your back," Clara said firmly. She dropped the cloth into the basin. She moved to stand in front of him. He looked up at her. His face was mostly clean now, the harsh angles stark in the firelight. He looked broken. The iron facade finally cracked open to reveal the exhausted, desperate man beneath. "Why did you come down to the valley, Clara?" he asked. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was tight, urgent. The heat of his skin burned through her damp sleeve. "You could have stayed here. You could have locked the doors. You owe these people nothing." Clara looked down at him. She looked at his bruised, calloused hands. She looked at the heavy gold signet ring on her own finger. It no longer felt like a shackle. It felt like a weight she had chosen to carry. "I did not marry a ghost, Gideon," she said quietly, "and I did not come to the north to hide. You bought a wife to manage your estate. I was managing it." Gideon stared at her. The slate-gray eyes searched her face, looking for the lie, looking for the polite fiction. He found none. He found only the sharp, grounded reality of the woman who had stood abandoned at an altar and refused to break. He pulled on her wrist, forcing her to step closer between his knees. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in the coarse wool of her ruined dress. He smelled of smoke, sweat, and carbolic soap. Clara inhaled sharply. It was the first time he had touched her outside the brutal, silent transactions of their bed. It was a surrender. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then her hands came up. She rested them on his damp hair, her fingers curling into the dark strands. She held him tightly against her, anchoring him in the dark. "We are a grim pair, Duchess," Gideon muttered against her stomach, his voice thick. "We're practical," Clara corrected softly, resting her chin on the top of his head. The fire snapped and popped in the hearth, throwing warm light against the cold stone walls. They had not promised each other love. Love was a fragile, rotting thing, like lilies left in the sun. What they had forged in the mud and the ash of Ravenshaw was something entirely different. It was iron. It was respect. And as Clara held the ruthless Duke of Westfall in the quiet dark, she knew it would never break. The lilies at the altar were just the beginning. Thank you for joining Clara and Gideon on this harrowing journey from a shattered London wedding to the brutal, unforgiving moors of Ravenshaw. If you love this deeply human, gritty take on the historical romance drama, please hit the like button right now. It helps the channel immensely. Share this video with your fellow story lovers who crave raw, grounded tales over predictable cliches. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next heart-wrenching historical epic. We have so much more to tell.